Hello, I'm Marcia Cavanaugh. Thanks so much for joining us. Well, a major investigative story about State Attorney General Jeff Landry could send ripples throughout state government and politics. We'll hear from one of the reporters, and we'll discuss this story as well as New Orleans' diminished strength in the legislature, who's who among key local presidential backers, and Carnival crews becoming environmentally friendly. We'll also look at the aging municipal auditorium and proposals about what to do with it. On our stage are tonight's Informed Sources, Errol Laborde, producer of Informed Sources, Stephanie Grace, columnist, the Times-Picayune, the New Orleans Advocate, and John Zimmerman, reporter, the Times-Picayune, the New Orleans Advocate. And we're going to go over to Stephanie first because things are starting, they're brewing up in Baton Rouge with the legislative session, coming up in March.
Pretty soon after Mardi Gras.
Committee appointments in New Orleans is really... weekend.
Kind of shockingly weekend, I have to say. You know, there was all this talk about who was going to be the House Speaker. There was the big fight. Clay Schexnayder from Gonzales ended up winning that. The Senate President is Paige Cortez. He's from Lafayette. And interestingly enough, once the committee assignments were finally rolled out, it turns out that their home regions did very, very well. You know, who didn't? New Orleans and the New Orleans area. And I talk about the area because, of course, New Orleans is very Democratic, but the suburbs are very Republican. So it kind of, we kind of took hits on both fronts. And the House, it's really striking because there is not one committee chair in the House, which is, of course, the bigger chamber from New Orleans or Jefferson or St. Tammany, the three big parishes around here. There are a few committee chairs there's one from St. Bernard, there are a few from the river parishes, but the big three parishes that make up this metro area are just not represented in the leadership. And this is a huge change from last session when, of course, the House Speaker was not from the area, but the Speaker pro tem, Walt Leger, was from New Orleans. The Appropriations Chairman, Cameron Henry, was from Jefferson.
Very powerful.
Very powerful.
Position.
Also very powerful Ways and Means Chairman, Neil Abramson. So people talk about the money committees in the House. Those are the House and the Senate each have two committees that deal with finances, and they're considered the most important committees, the most powerful. One spending and one taxation and one spending, and they have different names, but they're kind of the four top spots other than the official leadership spots. Last time, 3 of the 4 were from the New Orleans area. The 2 I mentioned in the House, and in the Senate, J.P. Morrell. Now, none of them in either house.
In the past, even when the local delegation looked weak, John Alario was always around.
And then there's John Alario.
Yeah. It didn't matter which house he was in. And he was always right next to the governor, so he was the power force.
And of course, he was the Senate president, not only under John Bell Edwards, but under Bobby Jindal. So he was an enormous force to be reckoned with. And he's gone. He was term limited out. So over in the Senate, there are a couple chairs from this area. It's not a complete wipeout the way it is in the House. But you don't have anyone in really one of the top positions. We have Karen Carter Peterson as a chair, Troy Carter, so 2 Democrats, seasoned Democrats from New Orleans. And then I think the one to watch is Sharon Hewitt. And she's a state senator from Slidell. She's a Republican. She's an ambitious Republican. Some people believe she might run for governor in the future. And she got a really key committee. She got the committee that's going to oversee redistricting, which means that she gets to have a big say over everybody else's districts. And that politically is a hugely powerful position.
And redistricting is coming up in this session.
It's coming
That's going to be a really big issue.
Well, not this immediate session, because the census has to happen first, but it's coming up very soon.
Yeah.
And this determines congressional districts. There's going to be a fight. We're not expected to lose or gain a district in Louisiana, but there are supposed to be fights over where the lines are, whether North Louisiana still gets 2 districts, whether there is a second district that, could potentially be a minority district, which would mean a Democratic district. So there's a lot of fighting coming up on that. And then it also is everybody in the legislature. So it really is determining their political futures.
And so, go ahead, Ann.
Would the numbers work out for a second congressional district with a minority? With a minority majority.
There is a theory that they could, part of the problem is concentration, is where the population is.
It'd have to be along the river.
Well, remember when Cleo Fields had that district? Cleo Fields, who's now back in the legislature again, when Louisiana had bigger congressional delegation, but 2 black majority districts. One of them was Bill Jefferson's in the New Orleans area. The other one was kind of spread out. It was a big Z across the state, remember?
Well, it was Baton Rouge and along the river.
And then, well, no, and it went up to Alexandria, and it basically hit all the cities because that's where you have big pockets of black population. And that was thrown out by the Supreme Court. Of course, the Voting Rights Act has changed too in recent years, so that's all part of this. It might not be, there could be another black majority district. That probably won't happen given that it's a Republican legislature. There could be a district where things are more even than they are now, because right now we have one very Democratic district and all the other districts are very Republican. So, there has been a push in recent times to have one be more competitive. This is, the kind of thing that probably most people don't worry about day to day, but it is very, very important to the politicians.
So in terms of the composition with all of these different committees and their chairs, et cetera, why is that so important to have a chair from your area on a committee?
Because the chairs really determine which bills get pulled before. Actually, the leaders of the chambers determine which committees get bills, and then the chairs determine whether they get a hearing, when they get a hearing. They're really kind of it's a fiefdom. It's kind of, whoever is in charge of education has a lot of influence on education policy. That's a guy named Ray Keller-Fellow from St. Bernard in the House. Whoever's in charge of, the taxing, you get to shape how the bill is, what's in the bill and what's not. And
so it's significant. It's meaningful.
It's very significant, yes.
All those times through the years when there were bills to spend more money on the Superdome for Superdome repairs, you really needed some strength.
You do.
And you needed a friendly governor on those things, too.
You do. And one of the interesting things here is that, of course, the governor, there were 2 different Republicans. The governor is a Democrat competing to be House Speaker. He kind of put his weight quietly behind Clay Scheck-Snyder, who got a lot of Democratic support and some Republican support. One of the issues here is that a lot of the Republicans in the metro area are more conservative, and they went with the other guy. They went with the guy who lost. So a lot of this is kind of spoils of victory. And if you win one of these elections, you look around and you take care of the people who are with you more than the people who are not with you.
Session begins
in March.
Okay, just right around the corner.
Yes.
Thanks, Steph. All right, John, to your story, which is really a complex story, and it involves our Attorney General, Jeff Landry, and his brother, and then another associate. I'm going to let you take it from here.
Sure, I'll do my best.
I don't want to get it wrong.
The story we published, my colleague Bryn Stoll and myself, in the NOLA.com Times-Picayune Advocate, is about Attorney General Jeff Landry and his foray into the H-2B foreign worker visa market beginning in 2017. Jeff Landry owns some companies, local businesses, around the Broussard area, and he and a couple of those companies that he claims full ownership of were part of this plan that he developed, or that his brother Benjamin Landry, who managed these companies, developed with a man named Marco Pesquera, who is a labor broker out of Houston, who is now an admitted fraudster. He's in prison. He's serving a 3-year sentence. And he gave us hundreds of pages of documents on his way into prison. He's looking for leniency. He's looking for a prosecutor somewhere to take interest in the Landrys and these companies. He gave us documents that included emails, internal emails in the development of this plan to import a few hundred welders and pipe fitters to work some of these huge industrial projects, liquefied natural gas facilities that are going on in Cameron Parish and elsewhere right across the Texas border. It's really Louisiana in this area is kind of the hotbed for these export facilities that are going up. This one in Cameron Parish is a $10 billion sort of long-range project.
So a need for laborers, a need for skilled laborers. And so could you just sort of background a little bit this program that the federal government has, which allows employers to bring in these skilled workers?
It's a CAP program, so these are very coveted visas. There's 66,000 of them a year. They're non-agricultural workers. They're supposed to be in here for 9-month jobs, essentially. The workers themselves can bounce from one visa to the next for 3 years. So they can go from one visa to this visa to this visa. Marco Pesquera tells us that part of the sort of long game of this was to have a bunch of shell companies and basically take these workers and don't move them. You move the shell companies on top of them, essentially, over this 3 cycles of 9-month work. So you get 9 months, and they're strict regulations, fairly strict regulations about who can apply for these, what you have to be, what kind of company you have to be.
And so what kind of company do you have to be?
Well, you have to be in the contracting services business. You don't have to be. You can be a labor supply company, but there are different rules to that, and you have to kind of show that the short-term need is with Cameron LNG, Cameron Liquefied Natural Gas Facility, which is tough because that's a years-long project. It's a tougher standard, but they worked hard in these applications, Jeff Landry's companies and the company that his brother and associate own, to present themselves as contractors. Some of the documents that we were given show that there were false contracts, phony contracts submitted as part of these documents to make them look more like the contracting service company that they wanted to look like.
And so one of the companies were able to bring in some workers, correct?
Correct. Evergreen, Jeff Landry's wholly owned company, was able to get 130 welders and 65 approval for and 65 pipe fitters. That's 195 jobs. How many exactly of those visas were filled and they were able to bring all the workers over to work those jobs is not entirely clear. There was another company, Southern Innovative Services, that Benjamin Landry, who is an accountant, Jeff's brother, is a partial owner in, that also got approval for 113 positions or visas, and they actually had them taken away, or most of them taken away, and we're not sure why. But they were also involved in Cameron LNG at some point.
Doesn't a construction firm, the owner has to be a licensed contractor? Is Jeff Landry a licensed contractor?
He is now. Evergreen, the company that he owns, is now. He filed for a contracting license with the state toward the very end of this project that took place, that they got these workers
after the workers had already been in and their visas
after
were about
they had
to
been
expire?
in, they were close to running the course of this 9-month period, and that's when he got that license. The other 2 companies never did, before or after, and maybe that's sort of an indication of what kind of company they thought they were or presented themselves as before they applied for these visas.
When you bring in these people, do you have to provide for them? You have to give them housing and transportation and food?
And you have to set a prevailing wage. You have to apply for a prevailing wage determination in the area that you're doing this to determine how much you're going to pay them. And they have rights. A certain...
Right. Do they make less than what American workers would make?
They do.
Right.
Yes.
The Mexican workers do.
That's what immigration, the people who are experts in this and familiar with this tell us, that they set this prevailing wage, but it doesn't bring you to what an American worker would make.
And should we assume there were no American workers who could fill these jobs, or no?
Should we assume there were none who could fill these jobs?
Yes.
Well, they have to do certain things to find out, and they got dinged on that in the application process about doing enough to go out there and recruit American workers. Eventually, they were approved for these positions. They don't tell you why they were approved. They tell you what you're doing wrong until you get approved.
Okay.
So what's the angle for the company? How do they make money off of it?
It's a good question. I mean, there's a certain difference between how much you're going to pay an American worker versus how much you're going to pay a Mexican laborer, and not all of that difference is in the salary. Some of it is in the expense of these people under the program. H-2B are captive to the job. If they're going to stay here on the visa, that visa is attached to a job. They can't go anywhere. They're sort of a ready work staff, so it's easier for the contractor to say, oh, look, I get 100 people who can come in and weld right away. Let's do that, rather than having to do this and having somebody who can jump from one job to the next who's an American worker.
So Landry's company and his 2 companies and his brother's company, though they were subcontractors to
Marco Pesquera's company.
who's now a federal prisoner.
He is, and he got busted in
fraud.
a different visa. He pled guilty to conspiracy to commit visa fraud over a different series of schemes that happened before this Landry. In fact, he was being investigated a few years before this whole Landry deal took shape.
And there's no indication that the Landrys knew that he was under investigation.
There
is
isn't.
that
There's no
correct?
evidence of
Okay.
that.
Were you all able to talk to the Attorney General? Or
We
his brother?
tried on numerous occasions. We sent lists of questions repeatedly over several weeks and never were able to speak with him. He declined to sit down and interview. He's declined to answer any of our specific questions with regard to his business relationship with Mr. Pesquera. We encourage him to sit down with us and speak with us
But
about
he has
it.
made a statement publicly that everything was done in order, that nothing untoward here.
He has said that nothing he has done no-fully is the word he used. He's come out again talking about how this was a legitimate contract and that the need was clear, that there were no American workers who could do this job, and that's what they were called in to do, is help with this.
And of course, Attorney General Landry has been very strict about legal immigration.
On
and
sanctuary
illegal.
cities, he's been
fine for
tough.
legal immigration, not so much on illegal immigration.
That's right.
Okie doke. All right, well, we'll be looking for further on this story.
Thank
All
you.
right, thanks a lot, John. Okay, something that's a little bit fun now.
Yes.
Carnival throws and Carnival Cruise are sort of making an effort to be a little bit more green about it.
For several years now, there's been talk at the beginning of each carnival season about trying to be a little bit more environmental friendly, and nothing really major has been done. There are some small companies that do things, but people always said, well, the cost isn't going to work out. I mean, a crew like Endymion and Bacchus that buy thousands of beads. I mean, they really, they really need to get them from China rather than get these people, sitting somewhere doing them handmade. But we're seeing more evidence of consciousness by the crews this year. The Rex organization, for example, and Rex is very influential with the rest of Carnival. Instead of throwing plastic cups, they've developed a sort of a aluminum cup with the Rex logo on it, and to cut down on the plastic, which is going to be really, really novel. This is the first time we'll see that, and I suspect we'll see it in a lot of different crews. And then they're working with the ARC organization, which is an organization for people with learning difficulties, that over the last few years has been collecting beads and recycling them. This year, in addition to what they catch, they're looking specifically for beads thrown in the past identified as Rex beads, and Rex is buying them back from ARC and throwing those. So there's a lot of those sorts of things that are going on.
And also
Right.
sustainable.
Sustainable. This is okay.
But you
I will
gave
show
me
you. I'm a
here.
member of Muses. Some people know this. These are glass beads that Muses will be throwing this year, with an M
The
for
initial
Marcia.
M, and I'll
Yes.
definitely wear this.
And again, it's like this. This was
Beautiful.
a. These were beads from a couple
Yeah, I
years
love
ago.
those. Those
I've been
are
wearing
fun.
them as jewelry. I get compliments all the time. They cost $1, I think, from
So things that are
but
not
they
gonna
don't
be
go
thrown
in the
away, you can
trash. They
keep
go
them.
in my
Yeah.
jewelry box.
Right.
And Muses, I know, will be doing a lot of this year. Really, kind of leaning in on the quality versus quantity. We have bicycle bells, we have sleep masks, we have headscarves, we have all kinds of good stuff, and beads still, but not as many. And Bacchus also, Bacchus put out an interesting press release the other day. They said, compared to a few years ago, 2015, they are throwing more than 50% less plastic. So it's a real initiative. And of course, Bacchus, you're talking quantity here. And they're doing the same thing. They are throwing some kitchen items, some aprons, other crews, fanny packs. I mean, I think there's a real emphasis on throwing things that people might take home and use again or wear or...
You need to make that distinction. When they say we're not going to throw as many beads,
Yeah.
they still be throwing a lot of throws that aren't
Correct,
beads.
correct.
Yeah.
And there still will be beads. And there are, Muses, I know there are some people I know who are not going to throw any beads because they don't want to. There are some who bought extra. I mean, there's a range. And again, I think that reflects that some of this is really grassroots, that people who ride and cruise are looking to do a better job. I should say there's a new city ordinance that says that you're not supposed to throw big plastic bags. You can throw, little plastic bags that individual beads are in, but you're not supposed to throw the big ones. I mean, they want riders to, put that in a trash bag. There really is kind of a concerted effort. I trace it back in part to what happened a couple of years ago. There was one of those news stories that really resonated with people. And it was when they went into the storm drains on St. Charles Avenue and found 46 tons of beads. And that was, it was right around the time we were having some horrible flooding, and people really made the connection, like, what are we doing here?
How many blocks was that?
That 5 blocks. I mean, it was insane. And it's just this massive, incomprehensible number. And, people, I think, really did it became kind of a punchline. Muses actually had a float about the beads in the storm drains the next year. But it resonated with people. They remembered it. And, I think really this is a grassroots thing. It's, part of the global environmental movement and also local.
It's fun to stand out there and say, throw me something, too, when you have stuff like this. Where
and
you can really
again, it's something really great.
Them.
Yes.
Okay, we have to move on to the next
Yes.
segment now. And we're going to stay with you, Steph, about the folks who are presidential candidate backers in our state.
Yes. Okay, we just finished Iowa, or we're not really finished with Iowa. We probably never will be, but New Hampshire. And, of course, the names we heard were Bernie and Amy Klobuchar and Pete Buttigieg. And in Louisiana, the name you're going to hear is Michael Bloomberg. And that's because Michael Bloomberg's campaign is here in a pretty big way for a state that's pretty late on the calendar. It's April 4th, the Democratic primary. It's not a state that is a Democratic powerhouse state, but it's a state where that's, if we get to April 4th and we don't know who the nominee is yet, it could be important. So Michael Bloomberg, who of course has a lot of money, he has not participated in the early primaries. The first primaries he's going to participate in are the big Super Tuesday ones, which are at the beginning of March. But he's setting up offices all over the country in places you wouldn't expect, including Louisiana. So there's one on St. Charles Avenue. If you're at St. Charles and Julia, if you're on a float going by or you're walking by, you'll see it. It's right by our office. There are 5 headquarters throughout the state in the 5 major cities: Baton Rouge, Shreveport, Lafayette, Monroe, and of course New Orleans. And
he's got
paid staff. He's got paid staff. He doesn't have a lot of endorsements in the state. That's interesting. He has the mayor of Shreveport, and he's really been focusing on mayors. He, of course, is a former mayor of New York City, and his philanthropies have supported initiatives in cities all around the country. He has the one endorsement, but he has staff connected to some major players. He has Richard Carbo, who was John Bel Edwards' campaign manager. He has Ryan Burney working on the national staff, who, of course, was Mitch Landry's big political advisor, and also Tyrone Walker, someone else who worked at City Hall. And and he has Bill Roussel, who worked on LaToya Cantrell's campaign. So, again, none of these people have endorsed, and Mitch Landry probably will not endorse because he's got a CNN contract. I think it will be interesting to see what LaToya Cantrell does. I think it will be interesting to see what John Bel Edwards does, if anything. But in the meantime, people who helped them be successful are on the ground.
But Mitch Landry did say early that he liked Biden. He may not have technically endorsed him.
Right. But that was before Bloomberg got in. He also has a very close relationship with Bloomberg.
And what about the other candidates?
And the other candidates, but Joe Biden is the one I want to talk about because the person I have not mentioned is Cedric Richmond, the other major Democrat in the state, the congressman. He's a national co-chair of Joe Biden's campaign. They announced this week that a whole bunch of African-American legislators are supporting Joe Biden. And of course, Joe Biden, who didn't do well in the first couple primaries, they're going to South Carolina next. And his argument is he does best in states where you have larger black populations, and South Carolina will be the first test. Of course, Louisiana is one of those states too. So, I think those are if Biden stays in it, if he, kind of recovers a little bit, I think those are the two who have a foothold. The others, not so much yet, but except there are always Bernie people and they're around, but not an organization.
The night that John Bel Edwards was reelected, Cedric Richmond spoke. And to me, that night, he really broke out as a speaker. I mean, he gave an incredible talk.
Yeah.
And it showed what he could do if he really gets involved.
And he's out there campaigning in other states for Joe Biden right now. I mean, they're just trying to hold on to get to a place like Louisiana. Bloomberg has enough resources to really get in. They've hired a whole bunch of paid staff. You're going to be getting phone banking, and you're going to see signs. There are signs up.
And ads, I would guess, too.
And of course, ads on national TV everywhere.
Because he's putting a lot of money already into it. Yeah.
Now, something people should know about this, if you want to vote in the Democratic primary, you have to be a registered Democrat. This is the only election in Louisiana where that matters. A lot of people don't even realize they might not be registered in a party. You need to re-register as a Democrat if you want to vote in this by March.
All right.
And there's a Republican primary, same thing. So if you want to vote for Donald Trump, you need to be a Republican.
So you have to be registered to that party.
Correct.
Okay. All right, E, over to you to wrap us up. Municipal auditorium, discussion about City Hall.
Since Katrina, nothing is going on there. And finally, I think there's a little bit of movement what they're waiting was for FEMA to send a check, and that has happened now. I think it's clear one thing that it will not be is an auditorium, because we just don't need another theater. There's a lot of theaters right now. If you look down Canal Street, the magnificent Lowe's Theater isn't even being used right now, and so we just don't need that. And so it's got to obviously be some kind of use. And the mayor, LaToya Cantrell, is urging that it be converted in City Hall. Moving City Hall like into that Tremé area is an idea that's been around. Lambert Boisier, when he was on the council, used to urge that. He said he could bring a lot of energy, a lot of economic activity into that area. And then the current City Hall site, which, by the way, it's a modern building built in the late 50s, but it's never been a lovable building. It's not New Orleans. It's not New Orleans style, but it's a very valuable piece of property.
Right.
So imagine if City Hall moved out, the value of that property right across on Poydras, right by the Superdome. So it could be a windfall for the city. So there's always that idea of bringing City Hall in that area and perhaps converting the auditorium into City Hall. What's happened is the city has gotten $41 million from FEMA for this to do something with the auditorium, and so she's supporting that. Now a lot of people say, are questioning that, but with the right architecture, it's a big building, and plus it has a lot of parking space.
But it's not big enough. They
Well,
perhaps would have
what
to
they're
add-
going to do,
Yes.
well,
Or out.
the same thing is true with the current City Hall too. There's a lot of offices that are leased out in buildings around there, and so they have to build something and still lease buildings, but it has parking, it has green space around, and the public buildings should always have green space around so people can gather and protest or do whatever they want to.
Yeah.
And so it has those elements. It could bring new life back to that part of town, along Rampart Street, and maybe put more use into Armstrong Park.
So we'll see. I mean, the one thing is agreed upon is that City Hall has to move. The function of City Hall is just to stay in that building, need to leave that
and the
building.
building is,
As it is right
even
now.
though it looks modern, it's run down.
Okay. All right, sticking with you, look ahead.
This week, Thursday night, when the crew of Muses marches, it'll be celebrating its 40th parade.
20th.
And,
20th.
I'm sorry, 20th.
Age of 20 years.
I was looking ahead 20 years. Okay. But the importance of Muses and Carnival has been enormous. It's been a very, very influential parade. So
It really
congratulations to them.
Absolutely beautiful parade, too.
This weekend is the NBA All-Star Game, and the second half of the season, it's actually more than the second half, is coming up, and Zion Williamson is back, and these games have been really fun. And Williamson's not in the All-Star Game, Brandon Ingram is, which is great, but he's going to be in some of the ancillary activities and getting a lot of attention. We got him here, when they come back for the rest of the season, I would say go.
Okay, Stephanie on our bird watch, huh?
Yes.
That's okay. Done.
Well, it should be an interesting race in July. In the criminal court, bench lost 2 people from the bench, actually, in the last week and a half. Arthur Hunter stepped down
That's
from
right.
Section
That's right.
K of Orleans after 20 years. He's said to be going to run for DA. And Byron C. Williams resigned. He was under interim suspension for 18 months or more, getting paid, and he finally resigned before any of that reached
So
the public.
2 seats now open on criminal court,
Correct.
Orleans criminal court. All right, guys, thanks a lot for being here. Thank you all for joining us. We'll see you again next week for Informed Sources. Happy Valentine's Day. Have a good evening.